K and L, we would like to get the same as well. Okay, that's cool. Okay.
Dude, that's awesome. Oh my god. Try one of these. It is. Well, that looks awesome.
Yeah.
Can you go from zero?
Go for it.
You can see the cutting over here.